Good afternoon. My name is Duncan McFarlane. I'm a professor within the Institute for Manufacturing in Cambridge. The Institute for Manufacturing is part of the engineering department, and within the Institute for Manufacturing, we focus on almost every aspect of the manufacturing supply chain you can imagine. Today's webinar is particularly focusing on some of the work we've been doing in the last 6 to 9 months in the healthcare domain. So firstly, just as I said, the IFM takes a very big focus on any aspect of manufacturing, and that's reflected in the way we look at healthcare. And I won't go through everything you see on the slide there, but you'll see that what we do is focus from very early stage clinical trial production in pharmaceuticals through to the primary manufacturing of a pharmaceutical and equipment products, secondary manufacturing, turning them into specific equipment or consumable items used in healthcare, and then the distribution and use. And actually, so this talk today cuts across the manufacturing and the distribution and use, because what we're talking about is a product that we've developed at the IFM in conjunction with hospital partners, and then looked at its usage. What I should say is that a lot of our focus in the last 6 to 9 months during this, what let's call the COVID period, has been focused around the right-hand side, where we've been focusing very much on supporting hospitals, particularly those in our local area. Also, because we've been left to stay at home quite often, we've had to make use of all sorts of different facilities in order to do our planning. So what you see there is in fact my bedroom cupboards, and on the bedroom cupboards is the four-pronged plan we developed early on in the way that the IFM would support local hospitals during the COVID period, particularly during the initial surge back in March to June, and those supports ranged, have actually been, some of them have been covered in the previous 2 webinars. So in webinar 1, we actually did a lot of, we presented some of our work on in-hospital logistics, and particularly the modelling of patient flow and resource and demand prediction within hospitals. In fact, we had a whole sequence of different projects that our students and researchers were performing in that space. Then the second webinar focused more on the PPE supply chain and some of the many challenges that were being faced, as hospitals around the world were seeking to acquire as much PPE as they could in order to support their response to the COVID surge. And so we had a sequence of activities there. And then one of the things we were looking at in the PPE and equipment supply chain was where we began to think about ventilators. In fact, we have a project on low-cost automation, and we received a number of questions from our collaborating partners saying, should we be getting involved in the ventilator challenge? When we sat down and looked at that, and that was particularly our automation group and our industrial fluidics group, we thought actually we were really not able to contribute very much to the way the many efforts being put in place already to develop ventilators. We offered support for some existing ventilator developments, but in a further brainstorm, we discussed the idea about potentially what's called a ventilator splitter. And in fact, in one of those discussions, a friend of mine put me in touch with 2 colleagues at Papworth Hospital here in Cambridge, who were experts, anaesthetists, experts in the ventilator space. And so on that note, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Chimney Padvarthan to talk about this need for ventilator sharing that we came up with jointly with them.
Well, I hope you all can hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, Duncan, for the introduction. My name is Chinmay Padvarthan. I'm a consultant anaesthetist and intensivist at Royal Papworth Hospital. At Royal Papworth Hospital, we are what we describe as a tertiary respiratory care centre, where we look after the most sickest patients with respiratory failure and lung failure. So crucial to our job is having ventilators, because the vast number of these patients, once the lung gets damaged beyond a certain limit, require to be put on a ventilator, which in simplistic term, one ventilator to one patient. At the beginning of the COVID crisis, as COVID emerged from Wuhan and spread across Europe and America, there were all sorts of stories going around about hospitals being overwhelmed because of different reasons, including hospitals being overwhelmed because of the sheer number of patients. And as we know, that most intensive care units might have about 50 or 60 ventilators. And if you've got more patients than ventilators, then obviously you're in this horror scenario, in theory, that you might have to consider rationing. And there were all these rumors floating about when we first came into the COVID crisis. But luckily for us, we never actually ran out of ventilators. But as this meeting with IFM showed, there was a possibility that we could look into splitting ventilators, i.e. using 2 ventilators for 1 patient. And that's the project that we worked on with the IFM. Now, what does that mean? Normally you have 1 ventilator for 1 patient, and in order to have 2 patients on 1 ventilator, you've got to think about all the possible problems that you might come across. And there are various societies across America and Europe who came out with their own guidance about how to manage these patients on ventilators. And indeed, there were some studies published in 2006 and 2007, even before this crisis started. And we really, at our first meeting, we had a list of things as a checklist as to what we can and what we need when it comes to ventilator sharing with patients. And these were mostly around the safety of splitting the ventilation between 2 patients, making sure that both the patients get the same amount of tidal volume and don't get additional iatrogenic damage because of the pressure generated by this ventilator. And Ronan would tell you how we conceived the project and we came up with the product at the end of it. So luckily during COVID, we didn't require using a ventilator sharing anywhere in the UK or for that matter in Europe. But there were cases I know of in America where they have ventilated 2 patients on one ventilator. So in COVID, the first wave's gone, we're facing the second wave, and we have plenty of ventilators in the NHS. But you can potentially see the need for such a device in the future. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier was, in any situation where the healthcare system might risk getting overwhelmed, having a device like this can come in handy. So just to give you an example, one of the situations I can think of would be a mass casualty scenario where you suddenly have an influx of 10, 15 patients to an accident and emergency where you normally have 2 or 3 ventilators. Now, a device like this potentially might help in stabilizing these patients until future help arrives. So it's definitely something that has a potential to be used in the future. As to what challenges we had is, first of all, it was time critical in the sense that we didn't know how the COVID would progress through the UK. So that was the first thing. And the other thing is, because of COVID and the shortage of materials in the hospital, we had to come up with a very simplistic idea as to whether we could split a ventilator safely with the products that are available within the hospitals. And Roland can talk about a few of the challenges that we came across. And the key design needs that we were thinking about is, first of all, it has to be safe. When you have 2 patients with an infection on one ventilator, we have to make sure that there is no risk of cross-infection. So we had to adhere to all the infection control norms that we normally would follow in a standard intensive care setting. The other challenge was around making sure that the right amount of ventilation goes into the right amount of patients. And as you imagine, patients are not static. their clinical condition improves or deteriorates. So if you imagine if the compliance of one lung falls, then we need to make sure that the device is robust enough to deliver adequate oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide, i.e. maintain the ventilation in different kinds of scenarios. And key to all this is patient safety, which is first and foremost, really. And making sure that all the alarms and disconnection alarms and leak alarms were all included. And this was the kind of design brief that we shared with IFM. And that's all I have to say about the challenges that we faced at Royal Papworth, and I would hand you over to Ronan.
Thank you very much, Chinmay.
Thank you.
So yeah, we had some really great discussions with Papworth, and Chinmay and Andrew gave us some really good guidance on what's been done internationally and the challenges. So my role, I'm also working in the Institute for Manufacturing, was to help take that vision and turn it into a product, which I'll tell you about now. And of course, the first thing we have to do is bring a team together to work on that. So we had a team of volunteers at the time, right at the start of the lockdown, who came together. And the first thing, of course, we did was review what was being done elsewhere. And some of those cases that Chinmay was able to point us towards gave us a lot to learn from. And we could make sure we weren't reinventing the wheel. We could see where the challenges were, because people were identifying why this is a sort of worst case scenario, a final resort, and where the real problems were. And especially we reached out to some of the teams for discussions, including the differential multi-ventilation team, which is an international effort led in Belgium. And Hannah Pinson there was linking up with our team and giving us the benefit of their advice and what they had learned. So what that meant was we could very quickly lay out each part of such a device and think, well, what are the options for each of these components? And I'll walk you through those shortly. And then we had a team who were able to then take those on and develop each of those components. And because of the time pressure, we had to develop them in parallel. So a lot of the management was really about identifying all the parts and seeing how they would interface, and as different options progressed, how that would influence other components. And luckily we had a great team of volunteers that were involved in the technical development, and they really took ownership of each of these components and worked through the different things which you'll see in a moment. And then within about 1.5 weeks, as we developed our version of a ventilator sharing device, we found that we needed a lot more help in, well, what happens next? How would we, if needed, bring this out to patients? And so you'll hear from Cassie, who is working very closely with CDP, and you'll hear from John from CDP about the regulatory challenges that we needed to think about. But then also to continue, we weren't doing this in isolation. Things were being developed externally, so we had to keep up to speed with those, but also look at what the scale of production might be if this progressed. And very importantly, the procurement was very challenging, as Chinmay already alluded to. This is really challenging at this time. So we needed to find a design that could use as much as possible from the supply chain within hospitals. And also, luckily, we had great support from a number of companies who were really on hand to send us things and really went out of their way to support this. And I put the list of the companies up there as well. So within about just over a week, we had a very rough prototype, which you can see here. And if you can see my mouse, that's where the splitting happens, right there at that Y junction. And we started exploring different types of valves, whether they're crimping valves like this or ball gates. And we're looking at these tidal volume measurements and just laying it out in our workshop with these test lungs to represent patients. And within 2 weeks, we were with Chinmay in Royal Papworth and taking this, a later version of that prototype, and hooking it up to ventilators and running tests and seeing, well, with the tidal volume readout, how responsive was it, how accurate was it, how stable was it, depending on the pseudo health of the patient, which we could imitate with these test lungs. And this gave us a lot of great information, but also great feedback from people who might want to use this, so clinicians in Royal Papworth. And that meant we saw that this is interesting, but actually one of the things that we could see elsewhere and also here was just how difficult it would be to set something up like this in an emergency scenario. So the next prototype within another couple of weeks was in a much more confined format, where it was a plug and play almost format. And I'll talk you through this. But this was the version that we've done the rest of our tests with, and we are progressing with these tests, and you can find reports on that online. But I'll talk you through some of these aspects.
Here's the ventilator sharing device on our workshop table. I'm going to walk you through the setup and describe all of the main components. So if we zoom in, we can see the two ports for the inspiratory and expiratory lines going from and to the ventilator. You can see we've reinforced them and we have a port there so we can fit the tubing from the ventilator. That goes to a YP splitter and the flow is divided to each of the two patients. We use check valves or one-way valves like these to prevent flow between patients and to hold the pressure within the system. There are other groups that are 3D printing these Y pieces, and we have an example of one of these here. If we keep following the line, we'll come to a valve to control the tidal volume or flow to a patient. This can be closed or opened to tune the flow. We're using a diaphragm valve, so when you turn the knob, it constricts that internal cross-section. If we keep looking further, the tubing available during this project was a little long, so if you have to use it, make sure to control the winding to avoid kinks. It comes out here to an inspiratory line and expiratory line, and this is the breathing circuit that goes to the patient, so we're going to follow this along. It goes to a filter just before reaching the patient. They connect here, and in this case, the patient is represented by a test lung from Ingmar. Now, when the patient breathes out, it goes back through the expiratory line, so we'll follow that, going through that same winding to a pressure indicator, just a visual indicator, but also a digital readout of the pressure. And there is our flow sensor. Here's an easier way of looking at it. And as the air passes through there, we're able to calculate the tidal volume and minute volume. And then on these screens, the pressures and tidal volumes are read out. That flow then goes back here to another Y piece where the flow is combined. Now we're going through check valves again. This is a different manufacturer, but the same principle. The two flows go back through a final flow sensor and out to the expiratory line. So we've now attached almost everything. We just need to power on the system. So this is powering our Arduino, which is calculating the flows and the pressures it's reading in from the different sensors. Right, that's now on. We better just connect the other patient now, and this is a second breathing circuit. There's the expiratory line and the inspiratory line, and that's also going to another test lung. There's the whole system. You can see the laptop where we are reading out the data that's being recorded in that unit, that display unit. Now we've turned on our ventilator, and you can see as the patient inhales and exhales, the lungs are moving up and down. And then our display is showing the tidal volume, minute volume, PEEP, and peak pressures, as well as a total volume. Now, the case has been designed to be easy to transport, and then we have a readout of the data from USB. You can see a handle there for moving it around, a bit like a briefcase. And then if I just step back here, you'll see again the overview where we started from. Thank you very much.
So you can see there that there's been quite a lot of development since the first couple of weeks, but it was very much a design driven by need and availability. And with that, I know it's a challenging area to get something like that, to even consider how you would bring it to market. And so we called upon experts for help and very generously gave their time and expertise. So with that, I'll hand over to John, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Ronan. So, hi everyone. My name's John Cook. I'm a mechanical and medical devices engineer at Cambridge Design Partnership. And we are a design and technology company who've been working for over 20 years now, developing innovative and kind of high-end complex medical systems. And as part of our supports to kind of the wider COVID effort in the nation, we were linked to the IFM team via Helpful Engineering, it's a charity. And we kind of said, how best can we help? We don't want to kind of tread on your toes. There's some great work going on here. There's some really good clinical inputs happening. What's next? And I think Ronan summed us up as the what's next team that kind of comes from this, which I think is quite a good description. So our work mostly focused around a regulatory side of view. So we've got the great clinical inputs from the Papworth team. That's been embodied in a really nice rapid prototyping method by the IFM team. How do we get that to the point where it can actually start delivering value and not just being a lab-based rig? And at the time, I'm sure you would have been aware, there were things like the big ventilator challenge that was a nationwide condition. And as a result of that, the MHRA, who are one of the regulatory bodies in the UK, issued this now infamous guideline on this rapid manufactured ventilator spec. And the intent of this was to very rapidly ramp up the UK's production of ventilators by slightly reducing kind of the legislative hurdles we had to get through. So we are obviously quite well up to date with this, and we used kind of our knowledge from this on how best we could help get this device to where it was needed, if it was needed in that worst case event. And there were three main areas for that. So the first one, IFU, or instructions for use, is an area. So we have to communicate to clinicians or the healthcare providers how to use this correctly. Now, the extra guidance from the MHRA was very, very specific towards a ventilator system. And so little guidance was provided for a splitter. It just wasn't something that existed in the definition of this standard. So we had to kind of almost do this entirely from scratch, think about how both it would be connected to two patients. What would be the result of things like I accidentally mix the two patients up? How does it fit into the OR or the emergency ward and all these kind of things to make sure we have a usable system as far as we could? And the other two big areas are test plan. So what points do we need to test to demonstrate safety? And are there any kind of quick fixes or kind of low hanging fruit that we can add to the design, particularly from a usability and human factors point of view, to try and improve it? And this was probably where we spent the bulk of our time. So because there was no chance of us kind of getting a full regulatory approval for this product. So for people who aren't familiar, a typical timeline for this could be 3 to kind of 10 years even for a large ventilator project. Our process was focused on giving the clinician kind of as much information about the potential positives and benefits and the risk balance so that they could make an individual decision on whether to proceed. And it was kind of at their liability. So we took the system and we started looking at system level risks, particularly looking at ways it could interfere, particularly with things like ventilator alarms, which we had experience of designing on a previous project. And out of that, we said, okay, if we test at these points, we think that this would be sufficient to demonstrate kind of a good level of robustness across the whole system. So our intent was never to demonstrate a fully medically approved system. It was always to kind of show this is a really good point where we can communicate what this can and can't do so that it can be used in that emergency situation. And I think I will now hand over, oh yeah, and here's the system that Ronan showed before with kind of some of those subtle kind of tweaks or quick fixes that we could talk about, particularly from the usability. So display, relative patient positioning of inlet and outlet and things like that. And I'll now, I will now pass over to Cassie, who will talk about the testing regime that went on.
Thanks very much, John. And as John said, it was really important to have that kind of risk assessment of the overall device and use in place in order to design a test plan that we could then use to look at how we can further improve the system. So one of those major concerns that Chinmay mentioned was around what happens when one of the patients changes their state, so their lung compliance changes. How does the system react to that? And so we were able to look at this by using the artificial lungs from Ingmar Medical and setting both patients in a similar starting state. Maybe, yeah. And then looking at what happens to the tidal volumes that are being delivered to the patients as maybe patient B's condition worsens and even further. And so we were able to test all of these different conditions that were outlined in the risk assessment plan and test plan identified by CDP. And we're able to check the alarm state functions properly, as well as looking at the time for the clinicians and the usability of being able to readapt the tidal volume delivery to each patient through the control valves on the ventilator sharing device. The other important thing that we looked at during the testing was some other potentially adverse scenarios that might happen. For instance, sometimes the line can get blocked by mucus that's expelled by the patient, or tubing can become disconnected through movement. So as I'll show in this video, we were looking at checking that the alarms function properly when one of these high-risk scenarios happened. So as you can see, we have the ventilator sharing system set up in the hospital, and the two lungs are being inflated and deflated with inspiration and expiration. And we have recordings of their tidal volumes and pressure settings. And then we can simulate an adverse event, or in this case, a disconnect of the tubing. And then if you hear, the alarms on the ventilator start going off quite quickly. And so we are recording all of these flows and different settings so that we can design a guidance for how to set the alarms appropriately so that they go off quickly, so that the clinician can be alerted to the adverse event and adjust the settings appropriately and fix that. We want to go ahead to the next one. Yeah. So these were just some of the tests that we're putting the system through so that we can make sure that it's safe if it does ever need to go into use, and how also to what changes need to be made to improve it further. And this is going to be a project by some final year students at the IFM, working closely with the clinicians at Papworth on future redesigns, focusing again on safety and usability. And from there, I'll hand back to Duncan.
Thank you. And okay, thank you, Cassie. And that really takes us to the end of the presentation. So what we've tried to do in this relatively brief time is to give you a sense not only of the product we produced, the splitting product we produced over the period, relatively short period, but the process we went through as well. So now in the remaining time we have, what we're going to do is put some questions, try to answer some of the questions you've been raising, and I'm going to pass over to Ronan, who's going to manage that process.
Hello, thank you very much, Duncan. So please, while we're talking, do continue to send in your questions. And as mentioned at the start, I think it's important to keep the questions in the Q&A one and technical support ones in the chat box, if that's okay. So what I'd like to do is, as we don't have one there that's come in during the speech, we had some that were pre-submitted, which I'm going to put to the panel. And first of all, how much does it cost? And would it be useful to make something low cost, assuming it isn't? I don't know. I mean, I don't want to ask questions and field them, but is there anyone who would like to start on that, and I'll fill in?
Shall I start on it, Ronan? And
okay.
Because I mean, it'll be a very quick start, but then I can hand it back to you. But I mean, as I think I said at the very beginning, one of the reasons we got interested in it, because we have this ongoing program that's looking at how to develop low-cost automation solutions for manufacturing, logistics, and service operations, and low-cost digital solutions, I should say. So that actually one of our initial drivers was to actually say, to what extent could we make use of low-cost elements within this context? Now, clearly one of the trade-offs in this process is, you know, we're dealing with a life-critical system that we're developing. So in many cases, you know, although I would say we used low-cost elements where they made sense to use them, but not at any point where they might challenge the effectiveness of the delivery of the splitting service. So, you know, if you say how much does it cost, it's probably rather a hard question to ask for a one-off. But it was significantly lower than a ventilator. Probably, you know, a tenth the price of a ventilator. But I'll hand over to Ronan, who's probably got some more detailed comments to make. But, you know, I think my main point to say is low cost was in the back of our mind all the way, because particularly as we realised that the ventilator situation in the UK was improving throughout this process, we were then starting to think about how we would support such a development in a low economy, a third world economy that may not be able to afford fully paying for devices.
So that's absolutely spot on. The amount for the one that we presented there was based entirely on one-off purchases in an open market. It's not really representative of a manufacturing cost. It was around, I guess, in parts about £800, but we know that's far in advance of what it would be. But then we were thinking, and I know discussions with Chinmay, that, you know, in lower middle income environments and countries, that this could be very useful. And in scenarios where there's an emergency response, this could be very useful, where you suddenly need a much higher throughput of these devices than you can possibly have by having lots of ventilators. So we are, as Duncan said, thinking about cost in the future designs, especially when we think about where this is going to, and we're very happy that it's not needed here, but it may be needed in specific responses. So unless there are any other hands showing on that, I will move on to...
I'm just wondering if John could actually comment as well, because I know when we started working with John, we were talking about the trade-offs between using very low-cost computing devices with software as opposed to looking at hardware solutions. And some of those issues were around the difficulty in getting approval for the development.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, Duncan. So the challenges of an Arduino-driven system as we have here is that it's a safety-critical software-controlled element. And that comes under a lot of scrutiny, particularly from the UK regulatory body. It's a whole extra set of risk assessments we have to do. We have to demonstrate we're in control of it. No one can come in and alter anything. And essentially, the system can't crash, and particularly crash in an unalarmed state would be a terrible outcome for us. So one of the solutions there is to go for a fully electrical-based monitoring system. So there's no coding element to it. It can't be changed. It's baked into hardware. The reason for that is less to do with kind of cost of goods. So the cost of goods for an Arduino versus an FPGA system, for example, are very, very similar. That was more of a regulatory burden and a time to market and getting things approved point of view. But yeah, from my point of view, none of the components in this are highly customized. They could all be used with off-the-shelf options. So you've got rapidly deployable and low cost of development option from that.
Yeah, and actually it's a very good point that low cost shouldn't be just thought of as being the cost of the parts, but it's the cost of the development and the cost of the deployment that's also important if you think about the cost issue.
So thank you very much. So we have some live questions that are popping up, and Is there a forecast date? This may be back to your advice again, John. Is there a forecast date by which the splitter is approved and available to the world? And I know, before handing that over to John, that's a very difficult thing to answer. Initially, when Chinmay came to us with these concepts, when we thought that it might be needed very quickly, we were looking at these emergency response measures, which were very short, which was why there was the high pressure. Without those measures in place and without the need for those, we have to think about the normal regulatory approach. So, John, would you mind mentioning that again?
Correct, yeah. So maybe the first thing to highlight is there is no such thing as approved for worldwide use. You get approval per region. So for example, the EU and CE marking is one route versus the FDA in the US, and various other territories have their own approval process. So if we were to go with that process, the first thing to do is define where do we want to launch it. Kind of the CE marking or the FDA approach are kind of seen as kind of relatively gold standard. So typically if you have enough data to get that approval, you can take it to other places, but they also need to review the data in their own specific way. In terms of a date, so we're not actively working on getting an approval for this. The plan at the time, like Ryan said, was to go through the emergency regulations, which are now not in use and not applicable. So there is no direct plan for us to take this to regulatory approval. At the moment, what we're doing and the work Cassie and her colleagues are doing is building up this great body of evidence that demonstrate really strong proof of concept. And that's really, really useful for if we did want to go ahead and produce a regulatory submission, that would form a core part of it. But there's a lot of activities that needs to be done before we're in a state to actually launch a product. So demonstrating that a one-off prototype works is fantastic, but it's only a small part of the journey. So we need to demonstrate manufacturing repeatability, usability, clinical relevance, that there's a very big long list. So no current plans to do it. I think we'd all be very keen to carry on developing it, but it is a large effort and this is not something we would just kind of ship overnight.
Thank you very much, John. And I think that, I hope, answers Monica's questions about the challenges of complying with regulations. And the standards are, as John mentioned, dependent on the region. So, you know, whether it's FDA or the European regulations, the medical regulations, and these are very serious medical devices. So, you know, you're talking ventilators are sort of 2B if you're used to the classification. So very serious, they need an enormous amount of documentation and trials. So there are very detailed regulations, and that body of evidence is something we can help build up now.
Perhaps if I could just add to that, Ronan, another challenge is that the idea of a ventilator splitter is not currently something that is defined within the standards. So there are standards that relate to ventilators, and they're very, very thorough, very, very precise. But we don't really fall into that category. We're kind of halfway in between things. So we would have to define almost our own set of standards, which is kind of what we did with Cassie to determine our own test points that are relevant to us. So the ventilator standard, for example, has lots of things dictating how loud your alarms have to be in the event of failure of a motor. We don't have any of those components. So we can't fully comply with the ventilator standard, but we also want to be seen as a ventilator kind of level of robustness and quality. So it's a tricky path we'd have to try and navigate to define that.
Thank you again. There is a question, David, what kinds of ergonomic tests were done and improvements that arose from that? I was wondering if anyone would like to mention anything about ergonomics.
I can speak briefly. I don't want to hog the limelight from anyone.
Well, go ahead, John, and then I'll tag on.
Okay, so when we were doing our risk level reviews, we obviously looked at kind of what foreseeable use errors we could expect, and then make sure that Cassie's test plan and program would address those directly. So all the way from the obvious things of, oh, I've got patient A and patient B the wrong way around, how do I check that that's working? All the way through to I've crushed or I've nicked a particular pipe in a certain way. All of that was purely kind of theoretical and paperwork based. So at the time we were in complete lockdown when we were doing this. So we didn't have the opportunity to go out and do kind of full formative testing with clinicians and things like that. So it was lots of Zoom reviews with Chinmay and his colleagues, as well as kind of user-based risk assessments was our input into this.
Go ahead, Chinmay.
I was just going to say, I agree with what John is saying, and we got lots of feedback from the medical staff in our hospital, and that was quite useful in tweaking a few things as well.
And I think that's something that we're going to continue to work on as the development progresses. And so, for instance, one of the key areas to work on from usability is how quickly are you able to readjust the tidal volumes of a patient should their condition change. And so that comes down to being able to control the valves and understanding the flow patterns within the device as you're manipulating those valves, but also what that feels like as the person actually doing the adjustments. And so that's a key area we're going to look at in terms of usability.
Thank you very much. And I think you may have seen the difference between that first prototype and the briefcase style. And that was one of the main feedback was, you know, there are a lot of suggested ways of doing this online that involved a lot of tubing and connections. And that's very difficult to manage in an emergency situation. So having it in a nice, confined, packaged, cleanable product was something that was fed back to us, which is why it was like that as well. There's one other question that was sent in, and then there's another live question I see has just popped up. And the question that was sent in before is, have we learned anything, or what have we learned about innovation? And I will hand that out to the general audience before commenting, because I realize that I'm talking a lot. Is there anyone like to say what we've learned about innovation from this project?
Yeah, I don't know if we, you know, it's what have we learned about innovation? I guess what we learned while we were innovating was, I guess, the speed at which you can do things is something that we, as researchers, probably overestimate. You know, if you've got to get something done quickly, you can actually. I think we were quite shocked about the fact that something was put together in 2 weeks. You know, and on average, we sit down as researchers to do 1 year, 2 year, 3 year research projects, and clearly we didn't do everything as rigorously and as extensively as we would in a research project. But the speed with which we were able to develop a prototype and then start learning from the prototype far and away exceeded most of the projects we've been involved in before.
Thank you. So I'll be, in the interest of time, with a few more questions coming in, I'm going to move on unless there's any other hands being waved. I don't see any. Thank you. Transportability is important. This has come in from Michael, and in African countries, as well as battery backup due to power outages. What's the power demand of the units? The units we were using were Arduinos. That was the only place where there was power, and I believe it was the screens were 5-volt DC. And we don't have battery backup built in. It is on our list of future designs for exactly that reason, which Chinmay pointed us in the direction of as something very important to consider as well. So hopefully that will be on the newer designs as well. So thank you for that. And a question was sent in if we were aware of the safety concerns internationally about splitting and sharing devices. And I was just wondering if I could hand that out to anyone.
Can I take this one?
Yes, Chinmay.
Yes, we were acutely aware of all the guidelines that has been issued by all the ventilator companies and different societies of critical care and respiratory medicine. And we did discuss this project with the hospital management and R&D before we embarked on the project. So yes, we are acutely aware of it. And one of the challenges, I think one of the things on my wish list as a clinician that I gave out to the IFM was trying to meet most of the challenges that were listed in one of the guidances. They're basically around making sure that there is a safety alarm, making sure that the ventilators are compatible for both patients in different compliance settings, ability to monitor pressures and volumes, and making sure the flows are not mixing, and there's infection control built into the system that might get developed.
So thank you very much, Chinmay. Yes, it was very useful for us to see that. Again, not something that we had been involved in before. So seeing what you had learned, and they were very useful design guidelines for us. These are the things that internationally are of concern. So then we needed to help tackle each one of those. So yes, it's something that filtered down through to us as well, that need to keep an eye on those and to continue keeping an eye on any reports and publications that have been coming out as well. So at the moment, that is the end of questions, and I don't think any more have popped up while I was speaking. So I would like to thank everyone well, first of all, thank everyone for tuning in, registering interest, coming along. It's been great that there are people who are keen to hear about this work, and thank you very much for listening. And thank you to all of the panelists who have joined today to share their experience of putting together this project and working on it. And also to the organizers, thank you very much for giving us a forum to talk about it. So I would like to end on that and remind everyone that it will be fully available. It's recorded already, and it'll be fully available online to all of those who registered. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone again and wish you all well.